Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Julia Dolan. I'm the minor white curator of the photography here at the Portland Art Museum. I'm so thrilled that all of you are here today to celebrate the last day of the wonderful exhibition, Sun, Shadows, Stone, the photography of Terry Toedtemeier. I know quite a few people in this room knew Terry personally. So it's really special that we've been able to host the exhibition here and to have you all see it. If you have not had a chance to see it yet, or if you're going to see it again for the final time in this iteration today, upon leaving the auditorium, you can simply take a left out of the auditorium and then take the elevator up to level 2M, as in mezzanine, and the exhibition will be right there for you. And the museum is open today until 5 o'clock. But we have a great afternoon prepared for you, a little bit of an hour or so talk about Terry and his work and his influence and his influences. And before I introduce our incredible panel, I just want to take a moment to point out this wonderful book that has been put together for the exhibition, Sun, Shadows, Stone. And if you don't already have a copy, you will be able to purchase one if you'd like right after the event here today. And if you so choose, everyone on the stage is an author of an essay in here. There are 7 different essays about different aspects of Terry's practice and his life and his history. So if you so choose, we would be happy to sign those for you. I would like to introduce this absolutely fantastic panel that we have here. We're also fortunate to have multiple people traveling in from elsewhere to be with us today. To my right, I will first introduce Hushka, who is the Director for Special Northwest Art Projects for the Tacoma Art Museum, and he is the curator of Sun, Shadows, Stone. So we are very grateful to you for putting this exhibition together and lending it to us for the past few months. This exhibition was exhibited in Tacoma from October of 2019 until February of this year, and Rock also spearheaded this accompanying catalog. Rock conducted undergraduate work at the University of Washington and holds a master's degree in art history from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Prior to joining the Tacoma Art Museum, he worked at the Helzer Art Gallery and at the University of Washington, at the University of Washington, as well as the Seattle Art Museum. To my left is Sandra Phillips. She is Curator Emerita of Photography at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. She joined SF MoMA in 1987 and was promoted to Senior Curator in 1999. During her years there, she curated many important exhibitions, including André Cortège of Paris and New York, and Cortège happened to be the subject of her doctoral dissertation at the City University of New York. She also curated Dorothea Lange, American Photographs, Crossing the Frontier, Photographs of the Developing West, 1849 to the Present, and Diane Arbus, Revelations, among many others. Currently, she is working on an exhibition titled American Geography, which looks into photography of land use. So even though she is Curator Emerita, she continues her work. And to her left is the incomparable Prudence Roberts, who many of you in this room know as well. Prudence is Terry's spouse and an art historian who recently retired as professor of art history and the director of the Helzer Art Gallery at Portland Community College's Rock Creek campus. She is also former curator of American art here at the Portland Art Museum, where she worked from 1987 through 2000. She was curator of Disjecta's 2012 biennial and is a member of the board of Crow's Shadow Institute of the Arts. And she received her bachelor's degree from Sarah Lawrence College and her master's degree in liberal studies from Reed College. And she is loved and respected very, very much by everyone on this stage. And I also learned that... Too late. I also learned today, one of the wonderful things about working on this exhibition is I learned so many things about Terry as we spend time together. And you were just telling us earlier that this physical space, even though it was a bit of a looking differently, the auditorium before it was renovated, that's where you first saw Terry. Terry.
Yep.
And the rest is history. And finally, at the end, next to Prudence is Toby Jurovics. He is the chief curator and Holland curator of American Western Art at the Joslyn Art Museum in Omaha, Nebraska. Prior to joining the Joslyn, he was the curator of photography at the Smithsonian American Art Museum and the Princeton University Art Museum before that. He holds a BA in art history and English from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and a master's degree in art history from the University of Delaware. He has organized exhibitions on Robert Adams, Louis Baltz, Barbara Bosworth, and Emmett Gowan, among many others, and is recognized for his exhibitions, including Framing the West, the survey photographs of Timothy H. O'Sullivan, and the current exhibition, The Race to Promontory, the Transcontinental Railroad and the American West, which is currently on view at the Crocker Art Museum in Sacramento. His upcoming exhibition, Fact and Fiction in Contemporary Photography, opens next year. So welcome to everyone, and thank you so much for being here today.
Well done.
So at this point, I'd like to bring Terry into the room. That's who we're here for. I don't know if Craig Hickman is here today. Craig apparently took this photograph back in the 70s. I have thought about this photograph a lot and looked at it a lot as I've worked on this project, bringing it here to this museum, and I like it. And I like being around it. I like thinking of Terry back in the 1970s, and I like thinking about what was he doing? This was a really kind of early point in his photographic career, so what was going through his head? And is this them going out on a camping trip to make photographs in the souped up VW, which I've heard multiple stories about. So it's really great to just bring him in the room and have him present with us as well as we talk through his work and through his legacy. And in terms of the structure of this panel, everyone has given slides to me, images to me, and we'd like it to be very conversational when at all possible. So at times we will go from individual to individual, curator to curator to talk about work, but then I am welcoming all of our guests to also respond at any given point in time because everyone here has had so much experience both with Terry and with his work. I would like to begin so that I can in many ways get out of the way. I am the only person on this stage who actually hasn't met Terry. And that's not necessarily unusual. I often work with photographers who I haven't necessarily met in person, but we have such a wealth of knowledge and information and ideas here. I'd like to at least get my thoughts out of the way at first so that we can move on to more informed information for you. I also want to start in terms of the photographs that all of Terry's photographs resonate with me, and it's been wonderful to spend months with them in the space of the gallery. I've never seen so many of Terry's photographs together in one place, and Prudence and I have talked about that. I think it was the same for you. Mm-hmm. To see them, so many of them on the walls has been really, really incredible. And it's been very interesting for me as well because I am the second curator of photography here at the Portland Art Museum, and Terry was the first. So I know so much about Terry through the history of the work that he did here. I know so much about Terry through all of the people on the stage. And I know a lot about Terry through many of you who are sitting here in the audience. So I feel like I do have some knowledge of him. Something that I didn't know as much about and was so thrilled to dig into a little more was the work that he was producing very early on. Someone who was interested in photography as a teenager and then turns to it quite ardently in his, I'd say, early 20s or so, even though he went to college for geology, and I think we'll all end up touching on that to a certain extent when we talk today. He comes out of college and he really starts to work more earnestly with photography. And what I love about that time, particularly here in Portland, is the excitement and the energy around photography in this town. And it was a time when photography was not necessarily being shown all that frequently in museums. Some museums, yes. Most museums, no. It wasn't considered the art form, perhaps, that it is today. It was questioned more frequently, as we hear today with everyone's iPhones. Well, everyone has a camera, so it's not art. That was being said then, too. But there was a wonderful group of artists in the community who were very, very excited about photography. And I have two examples of photographs that Terry was taking at this time. Chris Rauschenberg here on the left. He's also physically in the room now. I love that kind of meta sense of this work that comes back and lives with us, and the people are here with us to see them again. And then Lloyd G. on the right, who is actually Terry's father. And when I first learned about Terry, it was through the more iconic, if you will, landscape images, and then learning about this period of time when he is very experimental, when he and his colleagues are founding Blue Sky Gallery, which still exists on the North Park blocks and is about to go into its 45th year. There was such excitement around this medium. What does it mean to be a photographer, and what kind of images can we make? And so these are two examples of photographs that you will see in the exhibition. We have them kind of tucked back as a bit of a surprise, which I also love. And here Terry's experimenting with infrared cameras and photography, or infrared, excuse me, photography inside, which for those of you who make photographs, not a lot of people are making infrared photographs inside because it's not particularly easy. You mostly see it outside. It does make me think back to these images by Ouija, Arthur Fellig, who some of you may know. And there's a real kind of fascinating voyeuristic side to these images. But I love the fact that Terry is taking a technology that is very much still embraced by landscape photographers, but applying it to being indoors. And he's thinking about the history, folks who have come before him. He's looking at books. He's wondering what other photographers are doing in the world. He's very much part and parcel of what is going on in terms of the photography that's being made in Portland at the time. So here I have a photograph by Robert DeFranco and one by Chris Rauschenberg, two of the five founders of Blue Sky, along with Terry. And you can see this real kind of influence of snapshot photography, the snapshot aesthetic. We can even see perhaps some Gary Winogrand influence, maybe even William Eggleston in terms of cropping, street photography, everyday oddities, and so on. Some of the humor of Elliot Erwitt. So I absolutely love these photographs, and I've loved getting to know a younger Terry this way, and the type of excitement and energy that he brought to the photography community at this time here in Portland, both by making his own photographs, as well as establishing an institution that continues today to provide photography to anyone who comes through its doors anytime. Does anybody have any thoughts of this earlier work by Terry?
I think you did a good job.
Okay, so we will move on. I want to show two last photographs from my section. As you can see, the photographs that we were seeing were, early, mid-1970s when Blue Sky was being established. As we move out of the 1970s, Terry is beginning to move into the landscape in a way that we see him progress through much of the rest of his career. So we see him start to move away from his family, his friends, from infrared, from this indoor snapshot quality of photography, and toward the land that is so important to him. And for the most part, that land is Oregon. It is most certainly the West Coast, but he's most focused on Oregon. And so you see an almost kind of calming down in the imagery, and you see a turning to the world that's around him and that has been so important to him since about the time that he can remember. And so this is where I'd like to move into some images that Prudence has shared with us. And this first image, the Untitled Seascape that you see here, that goes by a few different names. When you have multiple prints by an artist, sometimes the title does change by the artist over time. And this is a photograph that he is making as he is beginning to move into the landscape.
Well, I chose this photograph, and I also wrote about it in a catalog because it intersects with so many changes in his life at that time. I mean, as Julia said, he was moving into more landscape, his drawing on his interest in geology, which I'll talk about a lot. But it also is an image that to me, so it was at a turning point in his focus, but it also is a photograph that has been more frequently reproduced than any other one he made, and that's because through a series of accidents, it represents a soliton, which is two waves which cross and are not deformed by that crossing. So it was a phenomenon that was fascinating in the 1960s and 1970s to both physicists and mathematicians, because they could, and I am no physicist or mathematician, because they could use it to describe phenomena in light waves and in sound waves. And when one of these scientists, through another kind of fluke, discovered this photograph, which was reproduced on a calendar for banning atomic energy, he tracked down Terry and asked if he could reproduce it in a book that he was writing about solitons. And Terry said, sure, if you just send me a copy of the publication, I won't charge you anything for reproduction. And that first step led to several other steps. And Terry, in my house, is now a bookshelf full of publications in Spanish, in Japanese, in French, in German, from all over the world, in these imponderable texts that I have no idea what they're about. But Terry's image is reproduced, usually at very poor quality, because they're textbooks. So that was step one of this. And actually, when I was starting to write the essay, I tracked down the person who originally asked to borrow the photograph, and he sent me a wonderful description of what a soliton is, because I certainly couldn't have included that in my essay. And he's still around, still teaching it in Colorado. Anyway, so that's step one of this, and Julia's included an image of the exhibition, because what you're looking at here is also two images that Terry did in the darkroom, one very specially toned, gold and selenium toning, I think. And then on I can't tell left and right either, but anyway, one of the images is digital, because while Terry never owned a digital camera, he, in about 2004, he developed a relationship with a guy named Phil Bard, who had a wonderful digital atelier here in Portland. And they scanned Terry's negatives, and Ocean X or Soliton or Wave in Shallow Water, whatever you want to title it, was the very first image that they scanned. And Terry was so thrilled with the way it came out, with the way it looked on rag paper, that he really never went back to the darkroom again. He started working with Phil on scanning his negatives and learning Photoshop. So again, this is sort of this image that reproduces, that exemplifies a couple of different points in his career. So, and it's also a killer image. So,
and this is upstairs right now, so you can see all three of them together upstairs, which is great.
And that, so Terry was a geologist, as you probably know. He got his degree in geology from OSU. And if you ever went to one of his talks about his photographs, you could be forgiven for thinking that you'd stumbled into some lecture on geology instead of art, because that was sort of the backbone of most of his photography. So here he is. This is a photograph by Evan Schneider, who's here today. Terry loved to stop at any road rock cut that you could find. He also loved rock shops, which are the boringest places in the world for me. So this is Terry, digging around in a road cut, trying to find, I think, I can't remember what he was looking for there, but anyway. So that's Terry, Mr. Geology.
Were you on this trip?
I was not.
You were not.
I was not on
Did you
this
hear
trip.
all about it when he got back?
I saw the rocks.
You saw that.
So one of
Speaking of rocks.
Yes, speaking of rocks. So I just chose a couple of other images that I think are exemplify so much of what he was about in terms of his work, which was the sort of overarching armature for it all was a profound love of the land and also a very deep understanding of the geologic forces that shaped particularly the basin and range country. One of his favorite books was Cataclysms on the Columbia by John Elliott Allen, who taught at Portland State. He was really thrilled to have met Dr. Allen and to have his copy of that book. And he also, so this is part of a series that he did going down to the coast on minus tide days and photographing, getting into caves and things, sea caves, and photographing parts of the coast that are relatively, or totally inaccessible underwater at other times. And I chose this because there is certainly a romantic side to Terry's landscape photography. And I think this, with its kind of, almost pictorialist background, the moodiness of the light, and then this kind of undulating form, the way that log running diagonally sort of centers and creates a kind of sense of depth in the composition. Terry was colorblind, and so he wasn't distracted at all by color. And his understanding of grayscale was profound. And this is also an inkjet print, so yeah.
And that's, Terry's printing is so sophisticated and so beautiful, and while it's wonderful that we have things like the internet that allow us to push Terry's work out into the world further and further if you can't experience it in person. Right. The ability to see his prints, if you are in this space and able to see his prints in person or at another museum where they are being shown, it's so critical to look at the original, the thing itself, as it were, to experience the way that he would interpret a negative and interpret the landscape.
Yeah, I agree. I agree.
And just to help ground people who haven't met Terry, I think it's fair to say that he had a fairly hostile relationship with the internet. He used it as a tool.
He used it as a tool. Yeah.
But the idea that his photographs, his art photography would be accessible on the internet would almost not be anathema.
I don't think it thrilled him. No, it definitely didn't.
It was conflicted.
Yeah. This is another image from one of his favorite parts of the world. This is the Owyhee country, and I don't know if any of you have been down to the Jordan Craters or Sucker Creek or Leslie Gulch. This is part of that terrain, and it's not in the show because it was a small edition and it sold out. But this, I love this photograph I chose, again, because of the composition. He's using a Linhof Technorama camera, which is a wide format camera, which, as you'll see in the exhibition, he often, instead of having horizontal images, he had extremely vertical ones. And this is, I think, the way that he printed this, because this was a gelatin silver print, with the contrast between that incredible sky, that summer sky, and then the forms of those rocks, the three-finger rocks. One of the artists that I think he looked at a lot was Richard Serra, the sculptor, and also he was enamored of Serra's Icelandic prints, the scale of those, the depth of them. And I think he looked at form and shadow in much the same way, in a kind of a sculptural way, because his shadows, he knew how to pull out that black when he needed to and how to suppress it. So.
And to carry the thought a little further on the Linhof, we are rather used to seeing photographs that are panoramic,
right,
but that follow the horizon line. That's a very kind of accepted way of seeing. We're very used to seeing that. And I love that Terry would take the Linhof and he would go vertical. And it is a truly different way to experience a composition that is photographic, I think.
Yeah.
He's not cropping. This is what the camera does.
No, not cropping. Exactly. Well, this is a place, I don't know if any of you have been there, the Big Wood River in Idaho, which is usually underwater. Terry liked dangerous things a lot, getting into spaces that might flood any minute. Everyone who went to the coast with him for those minus tide trips got wetter than they thought they would.
Did you?
Yeah.
Toby can vouch.
Completely soaked.
But this is a place that, like a lot of the places, well, all the places that Terry went, he knew all about geologically before we got there. And I was with him on a lot of these camping trips and things, because he would read topo maps, he would read, anything he could about like the geology of Idaho. So while he was rarely disappointed about things that he wanted to photograph, he always found something. But there were certain destinations which he where he knew he wanted to get there at this hour of the day and so forth and so on. And this was actually taken, this is a personal thing, but taken during our honeymoon. You can see me in the little scale reference there.
She's hard to find her. There she is.
Idaho.
She's in the mix of that grayscale there.
Yeah. You can see it was an extraordinary place, the Big Wood River. So that, and the composition, the kind of, he loved, as I'm sure you'll notice when you go up, if you go upstairs to the exhibition, he loved archways, apertures, openings, as a kind of, both for geologic reasons, but obviously also for aesthetic ones.
And if and when you go upstairs to the exhibition today, you can find this photograph pretty close to the doorway. If you move to the left, you will see it next to a number of other Linhof images that are all vertical. Really quite striking in terms of their abstract qualities as well.
Yeah, I agree.
So rock. No, before rock, I apologize. Yes, this.
Well, this is a photograph that Terry actually, he shot the film and his friend Stu Levy developed it after he died.
I see Stu here.
I think Stu's here.
He is.
Hi, Stu. And I just chose this. We had a show at PDX Gallery of about probably 15 or 16 of the images that were posthumously produced, and in a small edition of 5, and I chose only images that were atypical, that had nothing to do with basalt, or maybe just a little bit to do with basalt, but
hard to get away from.
This, and the title of the show was Unfinished Business, and I love this picture just because he had a great sense of humor, as a lot of you probably know, but I just love this whole image, and you can see his beloved Montero parked by the side of the road with the door open. And just the shift in the road and the kind of quirkiness of this image is so much about Terry.
And Prudence, you've mentioned to me a number of times how, because of Terry's knowledge of the earth, he truly understood that what we saw on the surface was nothing compared to.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. And so we get a sense of that with that break in the road.
Right.
The fact that there are forces underneath that are continuing to do what they do as we try to do what we would like to.
Exactly. Exactly. So
Rock, this begins some of the images that you sent along. You curated this exhibition. And so I'd love to know, as I had mentioned earlier, Prudence and I were remarking on how wonderful it is to see so many of Terry's photographs in one place at one time. And a lot of curating is about telling a story, choosing good ways to tell that story. How did you go about working with a group of photographs by someone you knew for quite some time and thinking about the audiences?
Great, thank you, Julia. So this was a 10-year project with Prudence, with Terry's passing in 2008. About a year after we began to conceptualize what a full retrospective of Terry's work might be. And there are a number of things that I tried to do, and the first is remind people in Tacoma and in Portland about Terry's body of work that he helped place in public museums, public institutions. And it's a secret thing that happened underneath the surface of the show, so I'm glad I get to say this publicly. But there are 30 works that Terry had, 30-some works in the Portland Art Museum collection. There are 20-some works that Terry guided to Tacoma Art Museum's collection. When I first approached Terry in 2003, he was delighted to give us a small number of works, but he was very specific about which ones he wanted to give. I wasn't allowed to sort of choose them. He came out with a stack from the darkroom, and we talked about which ones were good for Tacoma. And that was in 2001, and that interaction, that early interaction with him, always puzzled me. What was he up to? And then a third of the exhibition comes from the estate. And so Prudence and I spent many hours looking at the remaining works in the darkroom, trying to understand what was going on. And as a curator, I wanted to do two things: make sure that each major body was well represented, and then I was absolutely delighted and surprised by the aerial work. And so there's probably more aerial photographs in the show than it merits, but they're just so fun and so beautiful and so weird that trying to make, without them, I think the Terry story would have been less known.
No, I agree.
Yeah.
I agree. Flying was really important to him. Yeah.
And plus the way he made them. He made friends with a small plane pilot. He had a special camera mounted on a gyroscope. They took the door off the plane. Terry would lean out and then snap photographs, as they buzzed over the landscape. I mean, how weird is that, right?
In a horrible homemade sort of harness that just like terrified me.
Nope.
Yeah. So the exhibition started with the core works in Tacoma Art Museum, which included a couple from the road trip era of the late 1970s. And what fascinated me about that moment in Terry's career is he was very much responding to ideas in photography nationally and internationally. He was thinking about minimalism. He was thinking about time. But then he was also layering and making more prominent some other issues, such as this dust cloud. And that dust is just a reminder that there are people that inhabit this place. Prudence mentioned the cataclysmic geographical events. And if you read all of Terry's interviews really closely, you suddenly find a resonance between his understanding of that geological event from 11 million years ago or thereabouts to what we're doing to the landscape now. And I think Terry wanted us to think about those two adaptations of the landscape in parallel, and how both of these things, the geological changes and the human changes, are irreversible and happening in a kind of suddenness of time. And then we have no idea what the consequences are. And so that kind of poignancy really fueled my understanding and interest in Terry's work.
I love that you included this image and other images in the exhibition from this time period. When I look at these works, between, I think, it's 35 millimeter at this point, right? And then the really grainy prints and so on, you can feel how dry it is, or you can feel how snowy it is, but still dry. Or you can feel how wet it is at the coast. And I'm really impressed with the way that he was able to demonstrate that in these photographs. And I find them to be very powerful within the exhibition. And that makes me also think about place quite a bit. And I'm in many ways an interloper. I'm an East Coaster all the way until I arrived here 9 years ago. And Oregon is like no other place I have seen. The West Coast is like nothing else. And I'm really interested, if we have the time, to think about this idea of, we talk a lot about Northwest art or Northwest aesthetic, and that was something that was quite new to me. We talk about the West quite frequently, but perhaps you, and especially because you do a lot of work with Northwest artists, because that's what your museum uses as a grouping of artworks and artists, and so do we. And Sandy, of course, you've worked at SF MoMA, so maybe both of you can chime in about this Northwestness. being of the Northwest or photographing the Northwest, and what does that really mean? And then does it start to exclude things if we're not careful, like those wonderful mid-70s photographs that Terry was making? Is it only landscape that we can talk about the Northwest, or how do you wrestle with that concept of the Northwest?
Well, I think Terry's a great person, a great artist to think about this concept of regionalism. And just having come from 3 consecutive days at the Seattle Art Fair, I'm thrilled to say that Terry would love what I'm about to say. Is that he was both, he was very much of this place. He loved the people that inhabited this region. He loved the geological history, but he was also confident and smart enough in his own abilities to do what he wanted to do, to make the kind of statement with absolutely little disregard what colleagues on the East Coast thought. And it's that kind of love of place that is so important about what Terry does and what I've tried to do as a curator, because ultimately the story of American art is this really complicated tangle of many different stories. And if we default to, say, a couple institutions on the very other side of the country that are going to tell us what art is, then we lose our own sense of agency. And as art is resistance, as art as a declaration of who we are, as a sense of agency, Terry's a fantastic person, because I don't think he cared much about what other people thought.
Can I say something?
Yes.
I knew Terry really as a friend, certainly, but also as a curator. And I remember Bob Adams telling me a story, Robert Adams, photographer who now lives in Astoria, but who, when I knew him, first lived in Colorado. And he knew Terry for a very long time, and did a show with Terry actually here. And at some point, I believe it was he who encouraged Terry to go visit the Northeast, to go check out the Museum of Modern Art, and to show his work to John Tchaikovsky of Modern, because John, who was a person I actually knew and worked with, knew Bob and trusted Bob, and was genuinely interested in Bob Adams and what was going on in the West Coast and Western photography. His first big show was the Dorothy Lamb show, actually. And the story I got from Bob, and it would be interesting to hear what Prudence has to say, is that he literally got off the plane. He would not go out there. He realized that this was not something he felt comfortable with.
Yeah.
And he kind of reasserted his origins and his special attention to the Northwest. I think it's an amazing story.
Thank you.
I cheer him on.
Yeah, I don't
It must have taken a lot of courage to both
just turn your back on it.
that
Yeah.
and then to turn back.
Yeah. Yeah.
I realize we're getting some feedback in the mic, so we're working on that. Apologies. I wanted to bring this next slide up, which Rock provided, and again, something that I think Rock, Sandy, and Toby can speak very directly to, which is influences for Terry. Would you like to?
Sure. So I am sitting here with 3 of the nation's foremost photography scholars, so I'm going to be as brief as possible and defer. So there's an idea that Terry had that was so absolutely fundamental to how he developed as an artist, as a curator, and that was his work with the Columbia River Gorge. He curated 2 exhibitions called Wild Beauty. We all remember the incredibly important exhibition from 2008 that became a blockbuster for Portland Art Museum, and with that magnificent book. But Terry first approached this in 1982 as a sort of contract person working at Portland Art Museum. He wrote an NEA grant, and his research in the early 1980s really helped him engage with the historical photographers, Carlton Watkins specifically, which the influences you can see here, but also regional photographers, Sarah Ladd, Lily White, and others. And Terry almost single-handedly resurrected the reputation of these nationally known women artists working here in the 1890s, and brought them to the prominence that they deserve. And his fascination and his interest in this moment of this regional art history kept propelling him to the big Wild Beauty project.
Can I say another one quick thing?
Yes, please do.
The first, because I wrote about this in the catalog, and it, for me, was a big discovery. And I think Prudence was very helpful here too. It seems that the first Wild Beauty show was in great part from his own collection.
Yes.
So he would go out and find these pictures in yard sales or whatever, and rescue them and put them on the walls of a museum. I mean, how great is that? That's amazing. He was writing history. I think it's a remarkable.
Yeah, I
credit
agree.
to him.
I agree. Yeah, and a lot of the works in the Wild Beauty show, the later Wild Beauty show, came from Terry's collection as well.
Sorry to
No,
no,
this
fine.
is, you are.
And then I want to return to that notion of people in the landscape. And if you look carefully, in almost half of Terry's photographs, there's some evidence of humankind, whether it's people, whether it's roads, whether it's buildings in the far distance. And it's that relationship. One of the really humbling things about Terry, and maybe something we all can, bring forward, is that he really truly respected everyone he met. I mean, he would go on these crazy camping trips, often with Prudence, in far southeast Portland, and go off-roading with nothing more than his memory of the topo map, knowing that he wanted to go somewhere. And he would meet the ranchers, he would meet the local folks, and he could have these really fascinating conversations, which he would retell with great delight about the concerns and the interests and the character of these people that he would meet. And so and he was more comfortable with those folks than he would be here on this stage in a lot of ways. And that kind of respect, I think, is something that's so important to Terry as a person, as an artist, as a curator, as a collector.
Yeah. No, that's true. That's true.
Thank you so much, Rod. Sandy, your knowledge of, I apologize, this was, that was also a.
Yep, so I think I mentioned the aerial photograph, so I think we can just move to.
Okay. We have a number of examples of aerial photographs upstairs, so please do have a look. They are striking. And Sandy, this is one of the images that you sent along. You have such a deep knowledge of the history of photography in general, but 19th and 20th century landscape, certainly in particular, and into the 21st. And so love to hear your thoughts about Terry and his place within.
As we were all friends of Terry's, and he was an amazingly brilliant and wild, fascinating guy. And really, I met him when I was working on this show about the West, and I got to know him much better when my son was going to read, so that was very convenient. And we would come up, and a friend of mine was Susan Phillips, who was at the Reed College Art Gallery for a number of years. So I would see Terry a lot, and on a couple of occasions go out there with him on these trips to Cannon Beach or whatever, and those trips could be terrifying. I admire Prudence here for her sang-froid. But he was marvelous and so dedicated to the condition of the West, especially of Oregon. I love this picture. There's a picture that
Previously.
that was shown a little bit earlier. Of the, I'm sorry it's so small, but the combination of Watkins and Terry is wonderful. But what's so interesting to me about the picture that's
On the left. It's the same for you. Yeah.
Okay. Is you can see the burning type.
I think it's
in the
right up in there.
okay.
Yeah.
And it's this plus the fact that there's a penetratingly direct railroad. That this is a humanized landscape, even though it's completely absent of people.
Which you see with the flume as well.
Here, yes, and there's obviously, this is a wonderfully, this is about aerial perspective. I mean, perspective going down into the distant horizon there. But also, what is so wonderful is the craft with which this is made, and obviously he's very appreciative of this, and also the beauty of it. But it's also this weird presence, this strange, dominating presence in this somewhat wild landscape. One of the pictures that we bought at the museum, he would just print these things up and ask us to look at them, and I'm sorry it's not in the show. I don't know if, I think you have a copy in your files. It's a picture that he had taken like a week before of a skeleton of an animal that obviously had been eaten on a kind of plateau in the woods, and it was somewhere along the Columbia River. He would never divulge where, because he said he called it the prehistoric breakfast. And he photographed it, and he didn't want it changed.
Yeah.
He wanted to respect it, and I think that is so typical of Terry and his attitude. It was beautiful, and it deserved being photographed so that we could remember it, and then left. So this is a kind of record, and this, I love this picture. Yes, you can see the railroad, but you can also, I love these pillars that look like an anthropological fist or a pair of fists in the sky, shaking as the contest of human interference in the land. We would come up and have breakfast, and I remember once asking him to describe the origin of the Columbia River, and he put down his coffee, and half an hour later, he described it with excruciating detail.
Yes.
And it was shocking because it was so fast.
Yeah.
You probably remember that. No, and this one, because even though it's a picture of his friend, this is, I think Prudence was talking about his interest in these minus tides, and this is a picture of a friend of his going to them, and this is what he showed me too, the minus tides, which was always, it's always a little scary too, because you had only so many minutes to make these pictures, and then you had to escape.
Run.
Well,
Yeah.
stunning. Thank you, Sandy. And this was an additional one you selected that was, yeah, and this is also in the exhibition upstairs. Yeah. And was this a location too? I'm afraid I don't know Cascade Head from the Sea Cave. This is a location also that you would have to get in and get out of, or?
It's a sea cave.
Yeah,
So, yeah.
this is less, I think I've been there. No, I don't think you have to get in and out so
Okay.
quickly on this one.
So many of them smack of danger. So,
Yeah.
Yeah. Stunning.
Whoops.
Oh, no.
We have to do this by memory, huh?
Where'd
Oh,
that go?
wow.
Yay, technology.
This is unfortunate.
Look at, well, how about that?
Oh, Toby, it worked on my other two computers. I apologize. Toby knows Timothy O'Sullivan inside, outside, and upside down. And
Well, just imagine. He was one of the earliest conceptual photographers. Great influence on Robert Irwin. Very early,
see
yeah.
if any of them. We've got Terry. So is Terry making a statement here? What's happening?
So
Because
let's
all of
go back
Terry's
to
are
that.
in.
Now, let's go back
Let's
to
go
the,
back to that.
This
that
one.
The Oahe there.
Yeah.
So Prudence asked me to speak a little bit about Terry's relationship with 19th century photographers, which we will now imagine.
We saw Watkins.
We saw Watkins, and that I think is the person that Terry's most kind of associated with. But
Yeah.
I wanted to kind of read from two letters that that Terry wrote. One was in 1998 when I first met him, and the second was in 2008. And he was collaborating with me on a Timothy O'Sullivan exhibition. And I'll start with that one. And you know, coming out here, you know, we've all obviously known Terry a long time, and we wrote the essay. And you think about it, then you put it away. Then you come to see the show in Tacoma, and you think about it again. And now, you know, a few days ago, I said, you know, how would I really describe what happens with Terry's work? And for want of a better sort of metaphor, I'm thinking about this idea of a tripod, and you have three things. You have the landscape that the kind of the particular physicality that he sought out, and you have the camera. And the act of photography 30 years ago was a very different thing than it is now. And even though the Linhof is not a view camera, it's heavy. You know, you put it on a tripod, and you have to think to use it, which you don't with your iPhone. And the third leg of that, we all know that, right, is what I would say is biography. I mean, it's the artist, but it's what does that person bring to it, and what sort of sits on top of this? Well, it's obviously it's the print, it's what we see on the wall, but I think that there was something that Terry wrote to me, and it's really about the possibility of sort of revelation, and that much of the conversation has been about sort of how he was able to use the camera to kind of physically express sort of history of this place over this sort of long geologic period. But I think that there was something else that Terry saw in that. And since we don't have the O'Sullivan picture here, he and I when we were working on this, we just sort of sat there with a laptop and started flipping through these photographs that O'Sullivan had made in the West in 1867, and he just started to kind of cackle wildly. And he said, okay, let me tell you about how he's making pictures about, you know, geology. And so he knew, of course, nobody's ever read the King Survey reports voluntarily, except for Terry. And he said, you know, you have different geologists doing different things. So, you know, Clarence King is writing about this sort of, he's moving vertically. He starts at 120,000 feet below the surface and works to the top. And the other two geologists, Arnold Haig and Samuel Emmons, are looking at the topography. And he goes, okay, so how do you make a document, a photographic document that helps you show this? And it's an image like this, where, and this is very much like the O'Sullivan picture, where he said you pick a vantage point that allows you to see both the sort of horizontal expanse of the place and how it's built up. And then he had this great quote. He said, then in looking at this, in the O'Sullivan, there's this sort of horizontal plunge of this ridge line across the image, very much like this. And he goes, now that's what you do to add horsepower to an image. There's a drama in the expression of a space. It's about being able to position yourself within a larger view of the landscape and organizing the information in a pictorial way that is compelling. And I think that that's part of what he was doing, is trying to kind of bring this sense of excitement with him to the, what did he see when he was out there? Most of us couldn't spend as much time talking about basalt.
Oh, you finally said it. There you go.
Word.
But the other thing that he talked about, and let's see what else we have here. I mean, he was interested in this sort of, how photography defined both the sort of physicality of the place and there's the image that you can't see before this is this view of a contorted limestone formation that O'Sullivan made. And it's just the strangest picture for the 19th century. And it's almost this sort of close-up portrait of this rock that seems almost windblown. And I think about this image here where Terry's climbing down into this chasm to make this picture. I mean, as if you are becoming sort of part of the kind of literal fabric of this place. But the other thing that Terry had, I think, is this sort of affection for what he said were desperate places. And he was talking about, there was an O'Sullivan photograph that's almost exactly like this. It's the horizon of the Great Salt Lake, and you have water and you have sky. It's an albumin print. It looks like there's almost nothing there. You can sort of barely perceive the horizon. And Terry wrote, he said, what he was doing was reaching around the edges of what the medium will and won't do. The best photographers do this. Who knows what you can get away with the camera? That's why you go out and make pictures like these. Most people, he said, would say, I can't do this, or why would I? But you're dialing into more than the landmarks. You're dialing into the whole landscape, to the character of the place, and not just its geologic features. And that was interesting to me, that for all of this talk about geology, he said, this is about something much, much larger than that. And I first met him in 1998. I worked at a museum on the dreaded East Coast, but one that had a budget, and I could just buy a plane ticket and take a handful of acquisition money and buy pictures.
Nice.
And it was great while it lasted. They caught up with it eventually. But I was introduced to Terry through my colleague Peter Bunnell, and he said, you should just go out to Portland. I think you'd like this guy. And I came out and we spent 3 or 4 hours looking at prints, and this isn't the day before acquisition committees or anything like that. We just put 4 in a box. I said, send me a bill. And I said, but tell me a little bit about the pictures. And so, of course, I got this huge letter entirely about geography or geology. It's just more than you need to know. But then he said, the following is the beginning of an essay that I began very recently. Ultimately, the essay will turn towards the discussion of beauty, both in the natural world and in photographs, and also in the nature of scientific findings and descriptions of the physical. The photographs I create are simultaneously about several layers of beauty: the print, the subject, and the subject context, which I think is geology. The work I produce is made for a context that invites the viewer or reader to approach the landscape with a greater appreciation for the physical nature of the earth. I think we've all kind of touched on that. And then he goes back into this idea about what happened with photography, specifically in the West. And he said, something different happened in the 1860s and 1870s that suggested that photographers and their patrons were interested not just in the landscape as a source of beauty, but there were sort of these multiple levels. He said, I believe this has to do in part with the directness of interaction that characterized life in the American West. In the course of taming and civilizing the West, photographic concerns turned to other issues. The land as opportunity, the land as scenic splendor, a threatened wilderness, a bombing range, a strip mall, a source of pollution. And this is the part that really captured me about Terry, and it was never published. I don't know if it exists anywhere other than
think that essay.
in a photocopy in a file in my office. But he said, the focus of the land physically remains, and we ought to try to understand what that is. That the land is beautiful is the strongest clue I have towards a greater sense of unity. That there is both variety and continuity of form is what I address in the work, but the belief that it provides the tangible link between our thoughts and feelings for existence and the physical world, the planet, and the site of our existence. More to come, Terry.
I love being able to hear some of his words. To sum up, certainly. And Prudence, this is another image that you
Yes, another
offered us, which I think is a wonderful last image to have a look at.
There he is at the brink.
Yep. Yeah, that was photographed. I don't know if Ron Cronin is here today, but he's one of the people who went out with Terry to do minus tide photographs, and this is at a place, and I'm not sure quite where it is. They called it Thumper Cove because there was this water, rushing through one of those holes. So that's Terry always going out to the edge, but not taking unnecessary risks. Just he needed to be there to make the image that he wanted to
I
make.
think that that's entirely true.
You're right. You're right. There were some unnecessary risks there sometimes.
I imagine there are a few folks in the audience who have had such experiences with Terry. And one of the things that I love, even though I unfortunately never got to meet him in person, is learning about him through all of you and through all of you here. So we have a few minutes for questions or thoughts about Terry. We do have two microphones that we can pass. We do ask that you use the microphone so that everybody can hear your question, please, or your thought. And if there are any other summation thoughts that anybody on the panel would like to...
Sure. So surprisingly, we've only heard the word basalt once. So I want to correct that and just remind everyone that Terry loved basalt. And he's quoted as saying, "I love basalt, it's true." I don't know why, but it's true. So basalt was so fundamental to your interaction with Terry. If you like basalt, he liked you.
He did say he cheated once in a while and looked at sandstone and other kinds of rocks.
So didn't he have a show at the University of...
Merrillhurst called Basalt Exposures.
Right.
Yeah.
And he had examples of basalt.
He did. He had stone rocks in the gallery. Yeah. Some from his favorite collection. Yeah.
We have one individual in the front who has his hand up. Chris?
I was just going to say a couple things. One sort of trivial and one deep and maybe not even correct. But one is when in the late 70s, when I first got a wide lux panorama camera, Terry was like, "Oh, let me try it." And he took one picture, which was a vertical. Handed it back to me. And I should actually scan that negative and give it to you.
I'd love to see it.
Yeah.
But the other thing I was going to say is that thinking about the sort of East Coast and West Coast, I mean, the Portland and San Francisco were these real important hotbeds of photography. And if you think, okay, well, yes, New York is a big hotbed of photography, but New York, the photography was based on the advertising industry. And out here, the photography was based on the power of the landscape. And maybe that's a better base. But yes, when we opened Blue Sky in 1975, there were hardly any photography galleries in the country, but we were the third one in the Portland metropolitan area.
Yeah.
We were one of three.
Wow.
Well, I think now Robert Adams' first exhibition was at the Museum of Modern Art. So that was 1967, 68, I believe.
Was it 71 with Emmett?
There was a show
before
before
Emmett.
that. There was a show before that.
Well,
And
John Charkovsky was a photographer before he became a curator, and he loved landscape, and he photographed landscape, so. And he realized that Bob Adams was kind of radically rethinking landscape, so that's why he was interested in his work. I'm sorry to interrupt.
No. But I mean, it's a kind of. I mean, I don't think it was necessarily ignored in the same way, but the Peter Bennell, who organized the exhibition, was Emmett and Bob's work, and the review, you probably remember this, was called Lifeless with People or Without. But we were looking at all these Bob's pictures of Colorado Springs one day, and Peter, who really never left the island of Manhattan, came in and he said, "God, no place actually looks like that, does it?" So there is a sense, you do actually have to get out of the car and look around somewhere.
Microphone's coming, thank you.
Before I came to the exhibit, I had no idea that Terry was colorblind. And Prudence, I would really, really appreciate it if you'd speak a little bit more to that and how it was an advantage rather than a handicap.
Well, again, as I say, he had, if he was able to see things on the land based on, I mean, he had a great sort of sense of grayscale, but yeah. And so forms came out for him because he wasn't distracted by, seeing any color. But I think he always thought I had, I don't know what color hair. He one time, I'll tell this silly story, but one time we went to some resale clothing store, and he came out of the dressing room wearing these pants that were like this intensely horrible chartreuse green, and he thought they were a rich khaki color. So that was, but no, he could see form and shadow, he could see objects on the ground with this kind of clarity that completely eluded me. So I think it was an advantage. He did do a little bit of color work towards the end of his career, and again, digitally. And I think he relied a lot on Phil to look at color, and I also was always sort of on call to do a color consult on anything involving color. So, but I think it was a strength in terms of his black and white photography. Wouldn't you agree?
I mean, it's hard to imagine not being able to
see color.
See.
Yeah.
So I don't know quite how to answer that personally, but one thing I mean, we kind of touched on this earlier in talking about printing, and I think that there was a very specific formal language that Terry was dialed into that you see, I mean, particularly in Bob's work and in Mark Rudell, who you mentioned, I mean, looking at this over a 20 or 30 year continuum. And that, I think that I don't think in 30 years anybody will know how to make a print like those silver prints are in the gallery upstairs. I mean, I think that was of a particular moment, and that's something that's really, really disappearing. And part of it is that the materials don't exist anymore.
Exactly.
And part of it is that so many photographers think that screen or that is where you view images now. But I think he looked at that as a kind of formal language that went back more than a century.
One of the things I was thinking about when Blue Sky is having a 45th anniversary show, and I picked some works of Terry's to go into that show. And I was thinking about how much he loved the early history of photography and the early photographic processes and the kind of the wild openness of what people were experimenting with. And I think he saw some of that in Photoshop and in digital tools, which he was learning because of one of the things that I didn't mention with the Soliton image, when it was digitally printed for the first time, getting all that information out of the sky that he never could realize in a darkroom was, I think, what sold him on, on proceeding with scanning negatives and everything. But I think it was that kind of wildness and sense of adventure of digital technology that really turned him on to,
You could also see Terry's experimentation with this very
Yeah.
thing in that photograph, Hidden History, where Terry was a consultant on the conservation of the Watkins
Mammoth
album
print,
from
yeah.
the Oregon History Society. And he photographed the front and the back side of the spine and then seamed the two together so you could look at the same object, different sides simultaneously, and that collapsing of the regular order utterly delighted Terry. He was so proud that he did this conceptual thing. He would cackle.
Yeah, no, he was really thrilled with that, yeah, with the possibility, gleeful, yeah.
This is partly to rock, but I was so impressed with a show I attended in 2008 where Terry did a slideshow of his latest aerial work to the Geological Society meeting. And there was a standing room only crowd, and it was wonderful work. And it was obviously a project he had deep in his heart. And I was wondering if there's a chance to have more done with those particular photographs.
Probably.
Yeah,
So I very much see this. I mean, Terry was such a complicated and intensely interesting individual that my goal with this project was simply to lay down the foundation for future scholars to start to dig deeper. And hopefully the essays by Terry and Prudence and Sandra and the others will let other people who are much, much smarter than I am dig deeper and develop the understanding of his work. So thank you.
Any final questions?
I'm going to try to formulate this question. I think that when I look at the photographs, Terry is so absorbed by the what I would call the syntax, geological syntax of what's going on in the landscape. He's really kind of magnetically absorbed in these relationships. And I'm thinking of 19th century writers who were, whether it be Thoreau or Emerson, who are always looking for the harmonious relationship. And he seems to be very triggered by the collisions in the syntax, where the language breaks down, and then you get into the truth of the situation. And I'm just wondering, was he literary at all? Did he?
I think he was a better writer than he realized. He didn't read a lot. He was, I think he was a little bit dyslexic, but he was one of those people who just sort of knew things that he needed to know. I'm very envious of those people.
Well, the photographs are clearly reading the landscape.
Yes. Well, one thing he did read. I mean, he read geology books and he read topo maps. I mean, that was his bedtime reading, was topo maps.
Well, I think he
would go over to the Oregon Historical Society and make tons and tons of Xeroxes back in the day before digital stuff, and tape them all together and make notes on them and draw, some of the elevation changes, note them out. So he very much.
His absorption in the landscape. Is so deep. And I think that's where he goes. He's not particularly interested in the human comedy, but maybe the human relationship or the interaction with the landscape. But he's going to a pretty deep level, and my experience of it.
He is, and the other thing that I think it's important is that you don't see a lot of grand views in his work. We never went to the Grand Canyon. We never went to Crater Lake. It was more, not even the Steens. I mean, we hardly went to the Steens because it was just too obvious somehow. And he was more interested in the subtleties and not necessarily surprises, but the less visited places.
Maybe with the exception of the aerial photographs.
Right. And those again were, a kind of understanding topography better. I mean, they were research trips for him in many ways. So
I can't go any deeper with my questions, sorry.
Well, thank you so much. I'm so grateful to Toby and to Prudence and to Sandy and to Rock. And as you can tell, they have so much knowledge and wonderful information, and you can get so much more of that in the catalog if you are interested. I hope you do have a chance to go see the last of the photographs for the last couple hours of today, because we'll tuck those photographs away for another time. They're going to go to rest in the vault now. But grateful to everyone for traveling here and being with us here today in Portland. And thank you all for celebrating Terry's work in humanity.